At 1:07 on a Friday afternoon in late October, Serena Halstead ended an 11-minute video call with the 19th specialist who had failed to solve the same problem. She stood beside a Ferrari 250 GTO that had not started in 6 years and stared at the silent red machine sitting under the cool lights of Cascade Restorations in Pasadena. 6 years, $2.4 million, 19 experts from 3 continents, and still nothing. The engine remained cold. The car remained silent. They did not know that his initials were hidden somewhere inside the car. They did not know that he had once been considered one of the most gifted restoration engineers in Europe. Those details had disappeared from his life years ago. In 2021, while working in Italy, Mason uncovered evidence that several supposedly authentic collector vehicles had been sold using fabricated documentation. The fraud stretched across multiple organizations and involved millions of dollars. He reported it internally. Nothing happened. He reported it again. Within 60 days, his career was effectively erased. His name disappeared from records. His projects were reassigned. His reputation evaporated without explanation. He never sued. He never fought publicly. He simply walked away. Eventually, he returned to Pasadena because Clara was buried there and because Nora deserved to grow up close to family. He took the first job that allowed him to pick his daughter up from school every afternoon at 3 o'clock. That job happened to be mopping floors at Cascade Restorations. On his second day, he recognized the Ferrari immediately. Not because of the paint, not because of the body, because of a small mechanical signature hidden deep within the vehicle that only one person in the world knew existed. Himself. He recognized it and said nothing. For 4 months he pushed a cleaning cart past the car every day and watched specialists fail. He watched theories multiply. He watched invoices accumulate. He watched people focus on complexity while ignoring the simplest question of all. And through it all, he remained silent. Because before he decided whether to help, he wanted to know whether the woman who owned the Ferrari deserved to hear it run. On that Friday afternoon, standing in the middle of the garage while Serena Halstead challenged him in front of everyone, Mason finally made his decision. 72 hours. That was all he needed. And somewhere near the front window, a 6-year-old girl holding a red toy car already knew exactly how the story was going to end. Hunter Brace laughed first. Not loudly, just enough for everyone in the garage to hear it. The kind of laugh professionals use when they want to make sure everyone understands a joke has just been told. You? Hunter folded his arms. You think you can solve something 19 specialists couldn't? Mason looked at him without any sign of irritation. I didn't say I could. You just asked for 72 hours. I asked for uninterrupted access. Hunter shook his head and looked toward Serena. This is ridiculous. Serena surprised everyone by answering immediately. Maybe. She glanced at the Ferrari. But ridiculous has a better success rate than whatever we've been doing. For the first time all afternoon, Hunter looked genuinely annoyed. Mason said nothing else. Instead, he walked over to Nora, crouched beside the bench, and held out his hand. Ready? She nodded and climbed down while clutching Pip. Together they headed toward the exit. Wait, Serena called after him. Mason stopped. Monday, 8 a.m., she said. The building is yours. He nodded once. Good. Then he left. Hunter watched the door close behind him before turning back toward Serena. You can't seriously be considering this. I am. He cleans floors. For now. Hunter opened his mouth, then closed it again. Something about Serena's expression told him the discussion was over. Monday arrived cold and gray. At exactly 7:58 a.m., Mason stepped through the service entrance carrying a black canvas tool bag that looked older than some of the technicians working in the building. Nora was at school. The Ferrari sat waiting in Bay 4 beneath bright overhead lights. Serena stood nearby with a cup of coffee. Hunter stood beside her, clearly unhappy about being there. Mason set the tool bag down and looked at the car for nearly a full minute without touching it. The silence made everyone uncomfortable except him. Finally, he spoke. Who was the last person to run it? Serena blinked. What? The engine. 6 years ago. Who? My father. Mason nodded slowly. Good. Hunter frowned. How exactly is that useful information? Mason ignored him. He opened the driver's door and slid into the seat. His fingers moved across the steering wheel, across the dash, across the switches, not searching, remembering. Hunter Brace, the senior technician, stood nearby offering the same polished explanations he had been offering for months. Some cars, he said, were simply meant to be admired. Some things were not meant to run forever. Serena had stopped believing him a long time ago. Her father, Jeffrey Halstead, had left her the Ferrari when he died in 2019. She had never cared much about cars. The Ferrari smelled exactly the same as it had 15 years earlier. Leather, oil, time. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he smiled faintly. Still there. What's still there? Serena asked. The reason it won't start. Hunter rolled his eyes dramatically. Amazing. 5 minutes and he already knows. Mason stepped out of the car. Actually, I knew 4 months ago. That got their attention. Even Hunter stopped smirking. Mason walked toward the rear of the vehicle and removed a small inspection panel. A few minutes later, he reached deep into an area no one else had apparently bothered examining. Then he pulled out something tiny, a brass component no larger than the tip of a thumb. Serena stared at it. That's it? That's it. A piece this small shut down the entire car? Mason nodded. Not intentionally. Hunter stepped forward. That part was replaced years ago. No, Mason replied calmly. It wasn't. I personally reviewed the service record. Then the service record is wrong. The garage fell quiet. Mason held the component beneath the light. This isn't factory brass. He rotated it between his fingers. It's a custom machined insert. Serena looked confused. Meaning? Mason met her eyes. Meaning whoever restored this Ferrari modified the fuel delivery system. Why? Because the original design had a weakness. And? Mason smiled slightly. The person who modified it knew how to fix that weakness. Hunter crossed his arms. Convenient theory. Mason handed him the component. Look closer. Hunter did. A few seconds later, his expression changed. Barely. But enough. There, hidden near one edge, were 2 microscopic engraved letters. M.B. Serena stared at them. Who's M.B.? Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a clean cloth from his tool bag and began wiping his hands. The man who restored this Ferrari in 2011. Serena looked back at the initials. You know him? A little. Hunter's face suddenly lost color. Not much, just enough. Because unlike Serena, Hunter had spent years in the restoration industry, and there was only one MB famous enough for those initials to matter. Massimo Bellini. The engineer who had restored dozens of multi-million-dollar collector vehicles. The engineer who disappeared from the industry almost overnight. The engineer whose methods were still discussed at conferences years later. Hunter looked slowly at the maintenance worker standing beside the Ferrari. Then back at the initials. Then back again. No, he said quietly. Mason continued cleaning the component. Know what? That's impossible. Mason shrugged. Most things are until they happen. For the first time since arriving at Cascade, Hunter Brace looked genuinely afraid, and Serena Halstead was beginning to realize that the quiet man she had mistaken for a janitor might be the most important person who had entered her garage in the last decade. Serena dismissed half the staff before noon. By 1 o'clock, only 4 people remained inside. Bay 4, herself, Hunter, Mason, and an elderly parts archivist named Raymond Klein, who had worked around Ferraris long enough to recognize history when he saw it. Raymond had not spoken much all morning. Now he stood near the workbench staring openly at Mason. Massimo Bellini? He finally asked. Mason tightened a fitting beneath the engine cover before answering. That name belonged to a different life. Raymond laughed softly. I saw one of your restorations in Modena back in 2016. Mason continued working. Then you saw a very expensive mistake. No, Raymond said. I saw a masterpiece. Hunter looked increasingly uncomfortable with every passing minute. Serena noticed. She also noticed something else. For the first time since she had inherited the Ferrari, someone was not treating the car like an artifact. Mason treated it like a living machine. He listened to it, touched it, studied it the way a physician studies a patient. Every movement appeared deliberate. Every decision had a reason. Around 3 o'clock, Nora arrived after school carrying Pip in one hand and a backpack, almost as large as she was. She walked directly into the garage as though she had done it 1,000 times before. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, kiddo. Did the Ferrari behave today?" Mason smiled faintly. "Not yet." Nora nodded seriously. She ran a successful architectural design firm in Century City and spent her days making decisions that affected hundreds of people. But every Monday morning, without fail, she came to the restoration shop and stood beside Bay 4. Not because she expected progress, not because she understood engines, because her father had once told her the sound of that Ferrari's V12 was the closest thing he had ever found to pure happiness. She wanted to hear that sound just once. Sometimes things get nervous when lots of people watch them. Serena couldn't help laughing. "You think that's the problem?" Nora considered the question carefully. "Maybe." Then she wandered over to the Ferrari and looked up at it. "This is the one?" "It is," Mason said. "Pretty. Very. Will it run?" Mason glanced at her. "What do you think?" Nora looked at the car for a long moment. "I think it misses being driven." Nobody spoke after that, because somehow, despite being 6 years old, she had expressed exactly what everyone in the room had been feeling. By early evening, Mason had removed and inspected several components that 19 previous specialists had either ignored or assumed were functioning properly. Every few hours, he made notes in a small black notebook worn smooth from years of use. Serena noticed that he never used a tablet, never used software, never photographed anything. He trusted his eyes, his hands, his memory. Shortly after 6, while Mason was working near the engine bay, Serena approached him quietly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stop?" He looked up. "Stop what?" "Restoring cars." For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. Instead, he sat back against the workbench and wiped his hands with a cloth. "Because eventually I realized I was spending more time protecting lies than building truth." Serena frowned slightly. "The fraud investigation?" Mason nodded once. "I reported what I found." "And?" "The people making money were more important than the people telling the truth." His tone remained completely neutral. Somehow that made it worse. "You lost everything." "Not everything." He glanced toward Nora, who was sitting on a stool drawing pictures of the Ferrari. "Just the parts that weren't worth keeping." Serena followed his gaze. Something tightened in her chest. For years, she had measured success the way most executives did: growth, influence, acquisitions, valuation. Yet standing here beside a silent Ferrari, she was beginning to suspect that Mason Vance possessed something infinitely rarer: peace. At exactly 7:42 p.m., Hunter's phone rang. He stepped outside to answer it. Mason barely looked up. 10 minutes later, Hunter returned looking pale. "Everything okay?" Serena asked. "Fine." But it clearly wasn't. Mason finally raised his eyes. "Someone found out I'm here." Hunter stiffened. "What?" "The phone call." "How would you know about the phone call?" Mason returned to his work. "Because the same people who erased me from the industry tend to get nervous whenever I start solving problems." Silence filled the garage. Hunter stared at him. "You think this is about you?" Mason tightened another fitting. "No." He paused. "I know it is." Serena felt a chill she couldn't explain. For the first time, she realized there might be more at stake than a Ferrari restoration. Much more. Mason closed the engine compartment and stepped back. "We're done for tonight." Serena looked surprised. "Already?" "The repair is finished." "Then why not start it now?" Mason smiled. "Because engines deserve patience." He glanced toward Nora. "And because somebody has homework." Nora groaned dramatically. "Dad, nice try." As they prepared to leave, Serena found herself watching them. The little girl with the toy car. The quiet man nobody had bothered noticing for months. They looked ordinary, completely ordinary. Yet somehow, everything inside her life seemed to be shifting around them. At the door, Nora turned back suddenly. "Miss Serena?" "Yes?" "When it starts tomorrow, don't cry." Serena blinked. "What?" Nora smiled. "Everybody cries. Then she walked out holding her father's hand, leaving Serena standing beside a Ferrari that, for the first time in 6 years, might actually be alive again. The next morning, Serena arrived at Cascade Restorations before sunrise. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Nora's voice. "When it starts tomorrow, don't cry. Everybody cries." By 6:45 a.m., she was standing beside Bay 4 holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The Ferrari sat exactly where it always had. Silent. Beautiful. Waiting. Mason arrived at 7:12 carrying the same black canvas tool bag. She wanted to understand what he had meant. Across the garage, near the far wall, a man in a gray maintenance uniform pushed a cleaning cart slowly along the polished concrete floor. His badge identified him as Mason Vance, floor technician, third-party contractor. Nothing about him suggested expertise. Nothing about him suggested importance. To anyone paying attention, he was exactly the sort of person people stopped seeing after the first few minutes. Nora walked beside him wearing a yellow raincoat despite the clear sky. Pip rode in the pocket. "Morning," Mason said. "Good morning," Serena replied. "You seem nervous." "I am." "That's normal." "You're not nervous?" Mason looked at the Ferrari. "No." "Why not?" "Because it wants to run." Serena laughed, despite herself. At 7:59, Hunter entered the garage. He looked exhausted. Raymond arrived a few minutes later carrying a notebook and an expression that suggested he had no intention of missing whatever happened next. By 8:03, everyone stood around the Ferrari. Mason climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted nothing, checked nothing. He simply sat there for a moment, with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. Then he inserted the key. "Ready?" he asked. Serena nodded. Mason turned the ignition. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the starter engaged. 1 revolution, 2, 3. The V12 exploded to life with a sound so rich and alive that it seemed to fill every corner of the building at once. The entire garage froze. A deep mechanical symphony rolled through the room. Metal, fuel, precision, history. 6 years of silence vanished in an instant. Serena felt her throat tighten immediately. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard. Not loud, not aggressive. Alive. The Ferrari wasn't merely running. It sounded happy. Hunter stared openly. Raymond sat down on a nearby stool without realizing he was doing it. Nora smiled and whispered, "See?" Serena's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. Across the engine bay, Mason simply listened. Not proudly, not triumphantly. More like someone hearing the voice of an old friend after many years apart. After several minutes, he shut the engine down. Silence returned. Nobody moved. Finally, Serena managed to speak. "How?" Mason stepped out of the car. The custom insert failed. "That's all. That's all." 19 experts missed it. They were looking for something complicated. Serena stared at him. "And you weren't?" The truth is usually hiding behind the thing everyone thinks is too simple. Before she could respond, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot outside. Then another, then a third. Mason noticed immediately. So did Hunter. The color drained from Hunter's face again. 2 men stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing dark jackets. Not police, not customers. They moved with the calm confidence of people accustomed to getting answers. Serena looked at Mason. "Friends of yours?" "Not exactly." "Should I be concerned?" Mason thought about it. Probably. The men entered the building less than a minute later. One of them carried a leather portfolio. The older of the two approached Bay 4 and stopped several feet away. His eyes moved from the Ferrari to Mason. "Massimo Bellini." Mason sighed quietly. "Good morning, Renzo." Serena immediately recognized the name. Renzo Bellini, one of the most respected restoration masters in Europe. Articles had been written about him. Museums consulted him. Collectors competed for his attention. Yet the older man was looking at Mason with unmistakable respect. "We've been searching for you for 3 years, Renzo said. "I know. You never answered." "I wasn't interested." Renzo nodded as though he had expected that answer. Then he opened the portfolio and removed several documents. "The investigation is finished." Mason said nothing. Every finding was confirmed. Renzo placed the papers on the workbench. The people responsible have been removed. Silence settled over the garage. Serena looked from one man to the other. What investigation? Renzo turned toward her, the one that destroyed his career. His voice carried a hint of frustration, the one he was right about. Hunter stared at the floor. Mason remained completely still. Renzo continued. The International Review Board issued formal findings 3 weeks ago. Every accusation Bellini made was correct. He looked directly at Mason. Your name has been cleared. Nobody spoke. The words seemed too large for the room. 3 years. 3 years of silence. 3 years of disappearing. 3 years of mopping floors while the world forgot who he was. And now, standing beside a Ferrari that had just come back to life, someone was telling him he could have everything back. Renzo slid one final document across the workbench. The offer is waiting. Serena glanced at the letterhead and immediately recognized one of the most prestigious automotive restoration firms in the world. Renzo folded his hands. You can come home now. For the first time all morning, Mason looked uncertain, not excited, not relieved, uncertain. Then his phone vibrated. Serena looked at him and then looked back at the Ferrari. Something inside her finally snapped. She turned and pointed directly across the garage. What about you? She called out. The room went silent. 6 years. $2.4 million. Are you going to take my money and disappear like everyone else? Or do you dare even try? The man stopped pushing the cart. Before answering, he looked somewhere else entirely. Near the front window sat a 6-year-old girl on a wooden bench. He pulled it from his pocket and checked the screen. A text message. Nothing more. His expression softened immediately. What is it? Serena asked. Mason smiled faintly. Nora forgot her lunch. He slipped the phone away and looked back at Renzo. I have to be at Roosevelt Elementary by 11:30. Renzo blinked. What? Lunch delivery. Massimo. Mason. Renzo stopped. After a moment, he nodded. Mason. The older man glanced at the Ferrari, then back at the little girl sitting nearby holding a toy car. Something in his expression changed. For the first time, he seemed to understand exactly why Mason had disappeared, and exactly why he might never return. Renzo Bellini stayed for less than 20 minutes after that. Before leaving, he handed Mason a slim envelope containing the official findings from the review board, along with a formal reinstatement offer signed by 3 separate organizations. Any one of them would have returned him to the top tier of the restoration world overnight. The salary alone exceeded what Mason earned in several years. The prestige was immeasurable. The opportunity was the kind people spent entire careers chasing. Yet when Renzo finally walked toward the exit, the envelope remained unopened on the workbench. You should at least read it, Renzo said. Mason nodded politely. I probably will. Renzo smiled faintly. No, you won't. Mason almost smiled back. Probably not. The older man looked toward Nora. She knows, doesn't she? About what? What you're going to do. Mason glanced at his daughter. Usually before I do. Renzo laughed quietly. That sounds familiar. Then he extended his hand. Mason shook it. No speeches, no promises, no dramatic reunion. Just mutual respect between 2 men who understood each other perfectly. After the cars disappeared from the parking lot, silence settled over the garage again. Serena looked at the unopened envelope for several seconds. You're really not curious? Not particularly. They just offered you your entire career back. Mason considered that. No. No? They offered me the version of my career they took away. Serena frowned. What's the difference? Mason looked toward Nora. I didn't have her back then. The answer stayed with Serena for the rest of the day. Around noon, Mason left exactly as promised to bring Nora her forgotten lunch. He returned 40 minutes later carrying an empty lunch bag and a drawing folded inside his jacket pocket. While he worked, Serena noticed him unfold it twice. A child's drawing, a red Ferrari, a yellow sun, 3 stick figures standing beside the car. That was all. Yet somehow it seemed more important to him than the documents sitting untouched on the workbench. By late afternoon, word had already begun spreading through the industry. Photos of the Ferrari running again appeared online. Questions followed, then articles, then speculation. Reporters called the shop, collectors called, investors called. One man from Dubai reportedly offered 7 figures just for a consultation meeting. Another collector from Monaco wanted to fly a private jet to Pasadena. Hunter spent most of the afternoon staring at his phone while trying unsuccessfully to pretend he wasn't. At exactly 4:15, he finally approached Mason. "Can we talk?" Mason looked up from the engine bay. "Of course." Hunter hesitated. For the first time since Serena had met him, he seemed unsure of himself. "I knew who you were." Mason waited. "Not immediately," Hunter admitted. "But after a while, all right. And I never said anything." "I know." Hunter looked down at the floor. "I thought if people found out, everything would change." "It would have. I didn't want that." Mason nodded. "I know that too." The simplicity of the response seemed to surprise Hunter more than anger would have. "You're not upset?" Mason closed his toolbox. "Should I be?" "Most people would be. Most people spend too much time carrying things they should put down." Hunter stood silently for a moment. "I'm sorry." Mason studied him for several seconds. Then he extended his hand. "All right." Hunter shook it. Just like that. No lecture. No humiliation. No revenge. Serena watched the exchange and realized something she had been missing from the very beginning. Mason Vance was not kind because life had treated him kindly. He was kind despite what life had done to him. There was a difference. A huge one. That evening, after everyone else left, Serena remained in the garage longer than usual. The Ferrari sat quietly beneath the lights. She held a small red metal toy car in both hands. When their eyes met, she gripped the toy a little tighter. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back toward Serena. 72 hours, he said calmly. "No assistance, no interruptions. If I fail, you owe me nothing." Serena did not know it yet, but she had just handed the Ferrari to the only person in the building who actually understood it. Mason Vance was 38 years old. Mason was cleaning tools while Nora sat nearby reading a book. Eventually, Serena spoke. "Can I ask you one more question?" "Sure. Why did you agree to help me?" Mason continued organizing his tools. "Because of your father." Serena blinked. "You knew him?" "A little." He reached into the tool bag and removed something wrapped in a cloth. Carefully, he unfolded it. Inside sat a small brass plaque no larger than a postcard. Jeffrey Halstead, 2011. Serena stared at it. "What is that?" "Your father asked me to hide it inside the Ferrari after the restoration was finished." "Why?" Mason smiled. "He said nobody would ever see it." "That doesn't answer the question." "It does if you knew him." Serena laughed softly despite the tears suddenly forming in her eyes. Because somehow she understood exactly what he meant. Her father had never cared much about recognition. He cared about meaning, about stories, about leaving pieces of himself behind for people he loved to discover later. Mason wrapped the plaque carefully and handed it to her. "It belongs to you." Serena accepted it with both hands. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Nora looked up from her book. "Dad? Yeah? Are we keeping the Ferrari?" Serena laughed so hard she nearly cried. Mason looked at his daughter. "Pretty sure it belongs to Miss Serena." Nora thought about that. "Okay." Then she returned to reading as if ownership of a multi-million-dollar Ferrari were one of the least interesting topics imaginable. And somehow, in that moment, Serena realized she was no longer thinking about the car at all. She was thinking about the man who had brought it back to life. 6 months later, Serena Halstead found herself standing in a place she never would have imagined visiting before that October afternoon. Not a boardroom, not an architectural conference, not a fundraising gala. She was standing on a folding chair in the gymnasium of Roosevelt Elementary School, helping tape construction paper stars to a wall because Nora's first-grade class was hosting a science fair. "A little higher," Nora instructed from below with complete confidence. Serena adjusted the star. "This? Too high." "You literally just said higher." "Now it's too high." Serena laughed. Across the room, Mason was helping another parent assemble a display board about weather patterns. Nobody there seemed to know who Serena Halstead was. Nobody cared. To them, she was simply Nora's Serena. and for perhaps the first time in her adult life, that felt wonderful. The months following the Ferrari restoration had been surprisingly quiet. The story exploded briefly across automotive publications. Interviews were requested. Podcasts reached out. Documentary producers called. Mason declined every single one. Eventually, the attention moved elsewhere. It always did. The Ferrari remained with Serena, although not in the way anyone expected. Once a month, she drove it. Not to events, not to auctions, not to impress anyone. She drove it because machines built to move deserved to move. The first time she took it out along the Pacific Coast Highway, she finally understood what her father had meant all those years ago. The sound of the V12 wasn't merely noise, it was joy made mechanical. Afterward, she parked outside a small diner and cried for 10 minutes before ordering pie. Nora had been right. Everybody cried. Meanwhile, Mason continued working at Cascade for another 3 months. Then something unexpected happened. Serena bought the building. Not the company. The building. After a lengthy negotiation, she converted part of it into a non-profit restoration apprenticeship program for young technicians who could not afford formal training. When she offered Mason the position of director, he refused twice before finally accepting under 3 conditions. First, he would still pick Nora up from school every afternoon. Second, no public relations campaigns would use his name without permission. Third, students would learn ethics before engines. Serena agreed to all 3 immediately. The program opened the following spring. Applications arrived from across the country. Some students wanted to restore cars. Others simply wanted a second chance. Mason treated them all the same. Hunter stayed too. To the surprise of almost everyone, he became one of the program's strongest instructors. The experience had changed him. Not overnight, not magically, but enough. One afternoon, nearly a year after the Ferrari started again, he lived in a small studio apartment 2 blocks from his daughter's elementary school. The apartment contained almost nothing unnecessary. 2 mugs in the kitchen, technical manuals on a bookshelf, a hand-drawn cross-section of a Ferrari V12 engine hanging above the couch. His daughter, Nora, was 6 years old. She carried a small toy car everywhere she went. The toy's name was Pip. Hunter found Serena standing alone beside Bay 4. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Sure." He glanced toward Mason, who was teaching a group of students how to rebuild a carburetor. "I used to think talent was the most important thing." Serena followed his gaze. "And now? Now I think character is." Serena smiled. "Took you long enough." "Yeah." He laughed softly. "It did." Later that evening, after the students had gone home and the tools had been put away, Mason and Serena sat outside the building watching the sunset reflect across rows of parked cars. Nora sat nearby drawing another picture. Some things never changed. "Renzo called again," Serena said. Mason groaned. "That sounds serious. He wants you in Modena." "Of course he does. Apparently half the industry still thinks you'll come back." Mason leaned back in his chair and watched Nora concentrating on her drawing. "I did come back." Serena looked at him. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Serena asked the question she had been carrying for months. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason turned toward her. "Regret what?" "Walking away." He thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes I regret how it happened." But his eyes moved toward Nora again, not where it led. Serena felt her chest tighten, because she understood exactly what he meant. Some losses never stop hurting, some injustices never become fair. But occasionally life leads you somewhere you never would have found otherwise. Somewhere worth protecting, somewhere worth staying. Nora suddenly looked up from her drawing. Finished. She carried the paper over proudly. It showed a bright red Ferrari beneath a yellow sun. Beside it stood 3 people holding hands. One was obviously Mason. One was clearly Nora. The third had long hair and was wearing what appeared to be a very inaccurate representation of Serena's favorite blue jacket. Above them, written in uneven first-grade handwriting, were 4 words, "My favorite team ever." Serena stared at the drawing. Then she laughed. Then she cried. Exactly as predicted. Nora looked pleased with herself. "Told you." Mason smiled. You usually do. As darkness settled over Pasadena, the three of them remained there together a little while longer. No reporters, no collectors, no executives, no famous names. Just a father, a daughter, and a woman who had finally learned that the most valuable things in life rarely announce themselves when they arrive. Looking back now, most people think this story is about a Ferrari worth millions of dollars. They think it's about a restoration miracle, a fallen expert, or a career reclaimed. But that was never the real story. The Ferrari was simply what brought everyone together. The real story was about a father who chose his daughter over prestige, a little girl who reminded adults what mattered, a woman who learned not to judge people by titles or appearances, and a man who discovered that losing everything important to the world sometimes makes room for something far more important to the heart. In the end, the Ferrari started again, but more importantly, so did the people around it. And if you ask me, that was always the greater restoration. The end. Mason had painted it himself when she was 4 because none of the commercially available reds matched the shade he wanted. Nora had named it Pip because she thought it looked like a grapeseed. Mason had accepted the explanation without adding anything. He was good at letting people keep ownership of their ideas. Their mornings were simple: toast, apple slices, school, work, routine. After his wife Clara died in 2020 from complications following Nora's birth, simplicity had become something sacred. It was the only thing he could control. Nobody at Cascade knew who he really was. They knew him as Mason Vance, a floor technician hired through a staffing agency. They did not know that for 13 years he had worked under the name Massimo Vance Bellini. They did not know he had spent most of his adult life restoring some of the rarest automobiles in the world. They did not know he had restored the Ferrari sitting in Bay 4 himself back in 2011.